Under the pale dawn of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania's calm reputation shattered with a single sentence. My fellow Tanzanians, with great pain in my heart. The words did not come from a politician or a preacher. They came from a soldier, Captain John Charles Tesher, a man in uniform staring directly into the camera, not to wage war abroad, but to expose the one within. For decades, Tanzania was known as East Africa's quiet giant, no coups, no uprisings, a disciplined army loyal to the flag. But on that October morning in 2025, the illusion of peace cracked open. Tesher's 42-minute livestream swept across TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram like a storm no censorship could contain. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke with the composure of a man who had already made peace with the price of truth. His voice trembled not from fear, but from duty. Our country, he said, is being stolen. Within hours, his message had crossed borders, replayed in Nairobi cafes, shared in Johannesburg taxis, whispered in London's diaspora halls. And for the first time in years, Tanzanians asked themselves the question no one dared. When loyalty to the state becomes complicity in its decay, what does a true soldier defend, the government or the nation? This was not rebellion for power. It was rebellion for conscience, a moment when silence became more dangerous than speech, when obedience felt like betrayal. And so begins the story of a man who looked at a system rotting from within and chose to stand alone against it, not with bullets, but with words. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon on a continent tired of corruption isn't a gun, it's the truth spoken by someone who has everything to lose. Do you believe a soldier has the right to speak when his leaders forget who they serve? Please share this story if you believe courage should never be punished. Subscribe if you believe Africa's awakening has only just begun. It began as an ordinary weekend scroll through social media. Then Tanzania's calm cracked open. On the screen of a modest home office, a man in olive uniform appeared, his rank pins gleaming faintly in the light of a single desk lamp. Captain John Charles Tesher, a serving officer and weapons instructor in the Tanzania People's Defense Force, stared into the camera with an expression that carried both exhaustion and defiance. His voice was steady, his words deliberate, and every sentence landed like a hammer on the conscience of a nation. Our government, he said, has turned patriotism into theater while the people starve. We are guarding thieves instead of the republic. In 42 minutes, Tesher tore through the myths that had kept Tanzania's political system afloat. He accused senior officials of selling off national assets to businessmen tied to the ruling party CCM, silencing critics and using the military as a shield for corruption. His message was not a rant, it was a manifesto, calm, reasoned, and damning. At first, the video seemed destined to vanish into the digital void, but within minutes it began to spread, clipped, translated, reposted. Tanzanian youth on TikTok captioned his warnings with the words, "Finally someone said it." YouTubers broke down his speech line by line. Twitter spaces filled with voices from across the continent debating whether the captain's words were the spark of a coup or the cry of a patriot. Inside Tanzania, however, the reaction was far from virtual. Military intelligence officers rushed to contain what they called a serious breach of discipline. According to insiders, encrypted messages labeled urgent threat to state stability circulated through party channels. Soldiers' phones were confiscated in barracks from Dodoma to Mwanza. Internet monitors began deleting the video within hours. Yet by dawn, the damage was irreversible. Once truth escapes online, it cannot be erased, only chased. While the government scrambled, the silence of the state broadcaster TBC spoke volumes. Instead of addressing the scandal, it replayed footage of President Samia Suluhu Hassan inaugurating a road project, a fragile attempt to project normalcy in a moment that was anything but normal. The Ministry of Defense issued a short statement about discipline within the ranks, carefully avoiding Tesher's name. But silence in politics can scream louder than denial. By Monday, whispers had reached the markets, taxis, and university dormitories. If an officer dares to say this, a shopkeeper told a journalist off record, then the sickness must be real. The word spread not as gossip, but as revelation. Ordinary citizens who had long endured rising prices and shrinking freedoms felt perhaps for the first time that someone inside the system had broken the wall of fear. Tesher's act was more than disobedience. It was an X-ray of the nation's soul. For decades, Tanzania's pride lay in its predictability, a disciplined army, stable politics, and no coups. That reputation had become a comfort blanket for the elite, a guarantee that nothing would ever truly change. But when Tesher spoke, that illusion dissolved. The army's silence was no longer proof of loyalty. It became a question of conscience. His livestream marked a turning point not because of its production or duration, but because of its timing. Tanzania was heading toward one of its most contested elections in decades. Opposition rallies were being restricted, journalists were being harassed, and faith in institutions was crumbling. In that environment, Tesher's speech did not emerge from chaos, it erupted from suffocation. He did not call for mutiny, he called for awakening. He reminded his fellow soldiers that the oath to protect the republic was not an oath to obey the corrupt. That guarding the gate of injustice was itself a betrayal. His words, stripped of propaganda and protocol, resonated like a sermon, one that forced Tanzanians to confront a question their leaders had long avoided. How long can a nation survive when its defenders begin to doubt what they are defending? By the time the sun rose over Dar es Salaam, one truth was clear: Tanzania would never again be the same. The storm that Captain Tesher unleashed did not roar overnight. It grew in silence, spreading through whispers, through screens, through every conversation that dared to name the truth. For a country that had prided itself on calm, Tanzania suddenly felt like a drumbeat before a storm. In the days that followed the broadcast, something extraordinary happened. The government, usually swift and stern, fell into a strange paralysis. There were no arrests, no televised condemnations, no fiery speeches, only a wall of silence. Inside that silence, the nation began to tremble. Across Dodoma, Arusha, and Mwanza, people gathered quietly in markets and cafes, speaking Tesher's name in half whispers, half prayers. Taxi drivers played his words on low volume from their phones. He said what we all know. One man murmured to a passenger, "But now that he said it, we cannot pretend anymore." The state's silence was not control, it was confusion. Multiple sources within the army reported that entire units had been placed on restricted communication. Commanders confiscated soldiers' phones, afraid that one more video could ignite a chain reaction. Some junior officers were interrogated, others reassigned. And yet, even within the barracks, the whispers did not stop. It wasn't rebellion yet, it was reflection. But reflection in the military can be far more dangerous than anger. By midweek, foreign media began to take notice. Al Jazeera called it Tanzania's silent coup. The BBC ran a headline asking, "Has East Africa's most stable democracy reached its breaking point?" In Nairobi, commentators compared Tesher's courage to that of Thomas Sankara and Ibrahim Traoré, soldiers who refused to serve corrupt masters. The government tried to project normalcy. President Samia Suluhu Hassan appeared at public events, smiling, surrounded by ministers, as if the house weren't burning behind her. But her calm demeanor could not hide the fractures spreading through the system. Insiders within the ruling party, CCM, leaked that emergency meetings were being held late into the night. Some officials called for Tesher's swift elimination. Others warned that any harm to him would only turn him into a martyr. The regime's greatest fear was not Tesher's survival, it was his symbolism. Every dictatorship fears a man who speaks with nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, the diaspora turned his livestream into a global conversation. In London, Tanzanian students organized vigils titled Voices of Truth. In Toronto, activists printed Tesher's quote on banners, "When the soldier guards the corrupt, he has already betrayed his flag." On social media, the hashtag #TesherSpeaks trended across Africa for a week, drawing voices from Ghana, South Africa, and Burkina Faso. Within Tanzania, small acts of defiance began to surface. In the northern city of Moshi, a local artist painted a mural of a soldier holding a torch over a crumbling government building. It was erased within hours, but photos went viral. In Dar es Salaam, university students released a statement calling for a new moral contract between the people and their protectors. The moment had transcended Tesher himself. It had become a mirror for the entire nation. And yet beneath the digital roar, fear was real. No one knew what had happened to the captain. Some claimed he was in hiding, others whispered that he had been detained at a military base outside Dodoma. The government neither confirmed nor denied his whereabouts. His absence became its own form of presence, a ghost haunting the corridors of power. Regional analysts called it a psychological coup, a moment when power shifts not through guns, but through doubt. For the first time in decades, Tanzanians began to question not their government's strength, but its legitimacy. Was loyalty to authority still a virtue when authority no longer served justice? By the 10th day after the broadcast, the regime's strategy became clear: erase the message, not the messenger. Videos of Tesher were systematically scrubbed from local platforms while national news moved on to trivial headlines. But the damage had been done. The people had heard, the soldiers had wondered, and the world had watched. What began as a lone live stream had become a national mirror reflecting a painful truth. Tanzania's greatest threat was never rebellion from below, it was decay from above. And that realization, quiet, contagious, and moral, was more explosive than any bullet ever fired. When the echo of Captain Tesher's livestream finally began to fade from the headlines, its consequences had already rooted deep beneath Tanzania's surface. This was no longer about one officer. It had become a test of the nation's conscience. For years, Tanzania's ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM, had presented itself as the unshakable guardian of stability, the party that kept the army loyal, the streets calm, and foreign investors confident. But after Tesher spoke, that confidence began to crumble. What had once been seen as discipline now looked like fear, and what had once been called peace began to feel like suppression. In Parliament, opposition members cautiously referenced the broadcast without naming the captain. One MP from Mwanza declared, "A nation that silences its patriots must prepare to hear from its ghosts." The speaker cut his microphone within seconds. But the chamber fell into a telling silence, the kind that follows truth before denial. Outside the halls of power, civil society began to stir. University professors debated Tesher's words in classrooms. Legal associations discussed the constitutional boundaries between duty and moral responsibility. Students held candlelight vigils not for his death, but for the death of accountability. In the working-class districts of Dar es Salaam, taxi drivers refused to play state radio, choosing instead to replay the fragments of Tesher's speech circulating from phone to phone. It became a form of quiet protest, an invisible resistance carried in Bluetooth transfers and whispered solidarity. The government, sensing danger, doubled down on control. Independent journalists received visits from intelligence officers. Some newspapers were fined for publishing unverified statements that threatened national cohesion. Activists found their bank accounts frozen. Even within the church pulpits, priests were cautioned to avoid political sermons. Yet the more the state tightened its grip, the more the narrative slipped through its fingers. In private conversations, senior officials admitted something they had not said aloud in decades: the CCM's moral authority was collapsing. It was not a matter of military strength or political dominance; those remained intact. The crisis was spiritual. The state could still command obedience, but it could no longer inspire belief. And that distinction, as Tesher had warned, is what leads nations to collapse, not through revolt, but through decay. Economically, investors grew uneasy. A few Western consultancies paused contracts, citing uncertainty in the defense environment. Rumors of a reshuffle in the Ministry of Defense circulated as if the system hoped that replacing faces could hide fractures. But everyone knew the problem ran deeper. For ordinary Tanzanians, Tesher's act had changed the language of fear. Before, people whispered about corruption. Now they spoke of betrayal. They no longer blamed anonymous officials, they named ministries' projects, even individuals. His speech had given citizens a vocabulary for their suffering. Among the youth, particularly those in uniform, a subtle moral rebellion began to bloom. They did not defy orders, they questioned them. They saluted their commanders, but wondered quietly, who does this salute serve, the people or the powerful? In that questioning lay a seed that no decree could uproot. Across the Sahel, other African nations watched closely. For them, Tesher's warning echoed a familiar story, the same erosion of moral authority that had preceded uprisings in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. The parallels were undeniable: a tired population, a ruling elite detached from reality, and a soldier who finally dared to speak. By the end of the month, Tanzanian analysts began using a new term in their reports: the Tesher effect. It referred not to rebellion, but to revelation, a shift in collective consciousness that no censorship could reverse, because Tesher's act had proven something simple yet profound. In the 21st century, the greatest threat to authoritarian power is not opposition, but awareness. And once awareness begins, it cannot be undone. From Washington to Paris, from Johannesburg to Ouagadougou, Captain Tesher's outburst became more than a Tanzanian story. It became a mirror, reflecting a continental truth. In Western capitals, analysts initially dismissed it as another African mutiny. But as transcripts of his 42-minute speech circulated through think tanks and embassies, the tone changed. Tesher hadn't called for war, he had called for accountability, and that made his message harder to discredit. It was the kind of defiance the West claims to support in theory, but quietly fears in practice. At the U.S. State Department, officials described the event as concerning, not because it threatened democracy, but because it exposed the fragility of a system Washington had long celebrated as stable. Tanzania had been a reliable partner, predictable, cooperative, and peaceful. But behind closed doors, a question began to haunt policymakers. If even Tanzania, the quiet giant, starts to question its democratic soul, what does that mean for America's model of influence in Africa? European media framed the story differently. The Guardian called Tesher the soldier who spoke like a citizen. French commentators, still reeling from their losses of influence in West Africa, warned that the Sahel's fire is spreading east. And in African social media circles, Tesher's face began appearing beside Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta of Mali, the new generation of military reformers challenging Western-backed systems. But what unsettled Western observers the most was the reaction of the African public. Unlike past coups or uprisings, Tesher's message wasn't met with fear, it was met with empathy. Across the continent, people recognized their own frustrations in his words. From Lagos to Lusaka, citizens shared clips of his speech under the caption, "He's not just talking to Tanzania, he's talking to all of us." In think tank briefings, American strategists began speaking of a rising phenomenon, the moral rebellion, the shift from ideological opposition to ethical resistance. It wasn't about communism versus capitalism anymore. It was about truth versus decay. And that made it unpredictable, unstoppable, and deeply African. The West's dilemma was clear. For decades, it had praised African governments that maintained stability, even if that stability came from fear. Now it was confronted with African soldiers and civilians demanding a different kind of order, one rooted in dignity rather than obedience. Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré had already embodied this shift, nationalizing resources and rejecting IMF dictates. Tanzania, long held up as the model of moderation, now stood at a crossroads that could determine whether the Sahel awakening would expand eastward. In global media, commentators began asking a haunting question. Are these young African officers the beginning of a new political era, or the end of the West's illusion of control? And perhaps that was the most profound consequence of Tesher's act. He didn't just challenge his government, he challenged a global narrative that equated peace with submission. For the United States, the choice was stark: continue to back regimes that silence dissent in the name of stability, or finally engage with an Africa demanding sovereignty on its own moral terms. For the African Union, the challenge was equally urgent: define what true legitimacy means before the next soldier decides that silence is no longer loyalty. Because if Ibrahim Traoré's Burkina Faso was the spark and Captain Tesher's Tanzania became the signal, then the rest of the world had better start listening. This is no longer just about politics. It's about conscience, and conscience travels faster than power ever can. As the dust slowly settled over Tanzania, one truth refused to fade. Captain Tesher's voice had broken something far greater than military silence. It had broken the spell of fear. He did not seize power. He seized attention. And in today's world, that may be the most revolutionary act of all. Weeks after his livestream, no one truly knew where he was. Some whispered he had fled across the Kenyan border. Others swore he was being held in a military facility outside Dodoma. Yet his absence became louder than his presence. Like a candle snuffed out, his light only spread further in the darkness. Tanzania now stands at a moral crossroads, the same one that nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger once faced. The question is not whether Tesher was right or wrong, it's whether his words will be remembered or buried. Because once a people learn to question their obedience, no regime can ever truly sleep in peace again. His message was never a call for mutiny, it was a warning that peace without justice is only the silence before collapse, that loyalty without morality is not patriotism, it is surrender, and that every soldier, every citizen, every leader must one day choose to guard the system or to guard the soul of their nation. Across Africa, that choice is already echoing. From the deserts of the Sahel to the coasts of the Indian Ocean, a new generation is awakening, one that measures power not by might, but by meaning. They are inspired by voices like Ibrahim Traoré, who turned defiance into development, and by men like Tesher, who turned truth into armor. To the world, it may look like unrest. To Africa, it feels like rebirth, because the continent is no longer asking for permission to speak, it is speaking for itself. So tonight, whether you sit in New York, Nairobi, or Ouagadougou, ask yourself, when a soldier risks everything to speak the truth, is he betraying his country or finally redeeming it? And if that answer makes you uncomfortable, perhaps that's the beginning of understanding what Africa is becoming. Please share this story if you believe that silence is the enemy of justice. Comment below, do you think Captain Tesher's act was courage or rebellion? And if you believe, like many of us, that truth is the first step toward Africa's freedom, then subscribe and stand with those who speak when others are afraid. Because this is not the end of a story, it's the start of a movement. And one day when history looks back, it may say that Africa's awakening didn't begin in a palace, but in the quiet defiance of a soldier who chose conscience over command.